All right, let's get started. Thank you all for attending our webinar today. Our theme is Bridging Health and Healthcare. Our topic today is cross-jurisdictional sharing between tribes and counties for emergency management. This is our agenda for the day. I'm Rick Ingram. I'm a faculty member in the University of Kentucky College of Public Health. I'll be moderating your webinar. Our speaker today is Maureen Wimsatt. Dr. Wimsatt is the director for the California Tribal Epidemiology Center and manager of epidemiology at the California Rural Indian Health Board. She has 13 years of public health research and program evaluation experience, including research history with the University of Maryland, Washington State University, and the University of Michigan, in several independent consulting firms. She has a PhD from the University of Maryland. She's previously worked for an Indian-owned small business federal contractor in Washington State, where she helped evaluate health and education programs in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. So, Maureen, would you like to go ahead and start?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Rick, for that wonderful introduction this morning. And good morning or afternoon to all of you, depending on where you are in the country. Out here where I am in California, it's morning time. So today, for the Research in Progress webinar, I will be talking about cross-jurisdictional sharing between tribes and counties for emergency management. Although the scope of this webinar today will be a little more streamlined than our overall project and project goals, I do want to provide you with a bit of an overview about the work, about the research study, and where we're coming from and going, I guess you could say, in the next year or so here. So the project aims to study and promote cross-jurisdictional sharing of emergency management services between tribes and counties in California. So for purposes of this presentation, you might hear me say CJS, that would be cross-jurisdictional sharing, and emergency management would be considered emergency preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. So overall, the project provides both tribal and county representatives an opportunity to share their views about CJS and make recommendations about what they consider to be successful government-to-government CJS arrangements. In the long term, we will develop a CJS toolkit for this project, and we're hopeful that the findings from our research activities and also the toolkits could really help both tribes and counties to establish CJS arrangements so that both jurisdictions can access the funding that they need before, during, and after emergencies. Another important context to the project is the tribe-county CJS context. So there may be some on the webinar who are familiar with working with tribal jurisdictions, or maybe those who are just getting going in that work. Important reminders, though, as we do this research, that American Indian tribes, each of them are unique in lots of different ways. So that could include in governance, legal processes, in culture, tradition, different types of resources that the tribe has, including economic and social resources, and also in the tribe's relationships with local governments, including counties. Tribes are also at unique risk for emergencies due to their location in remote and rural areas. So many tribes are actually located far from major hospitals and county resources, but also tribes, due to their uniqueness, have varied capacity to address natural and non-natural emergencies that they might face. So despite the scholarly benefits we know about cross-jurisdictional sharing, which is that two jurisdictions could combine resources, work better together perhaps than one jurisdiction alone, it's important to recognize that only a tribe as a sovereign governing body can choose to enter into a CJS relationship with a county. So due to the uniqueness of each tribe, CJS arrangements between tribes and counties are expected to vary. We believe that would be particularly true when we proposed this project for the 111 federally recognized tribes in California. So the next slide I have for you is a map that I really like. It's from the EPA. I like it because it really clearly shows some of the tribal lands in California and the diversity of groupings of tribal lands in the southern area of the state and also maybe up in some of the northern coastal regions. But also in the middle of the state, it shows lots of counties where there may be one tribe or where the tribe is very obviously located in a rural area far from the cities you might know, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, or Sacramento. Another thing to point out about the tribal lands map is that many tribes in California are unique. There are a few larger reservation lands, Tule River Reservation down in Tulare County, for example, or the Yurok tribe up in the northwest part of the state. However, many tribal lands also in California are rancherias, much smaller jurisdictional bodies of land. There were 4 research questions originally proposed in our grant, and the scope of this webinar will be, just for the sake of time primarily, on this first research question, which is the current prevalence and scope of CJS between tribal and county governments. The methods that were proposed for gathering information to answer this research question was to survey at least 83 tribes out of the 111 in California and their corresponding counties. Other 3 research questions, which will not be covered in this webinar but are a priority of ours in this project, involves a deeper look at how valuable CJS arrangements are and what factors influence the value placed on CJS agreements. Those questions also look to identify whether tribes specifically are working toward achieving benchmarks in public health emergency preparedness. So those 3 research questions will be answered by examining a smaller subset of the 83 tribes and their corresponding counties that we'll discuss today. Again, the focus of today's presentation then will be on research question 1 and the prevalence and scope of CJS arrangements. A little bit about the study procedure for you to understand how we gathered the information. We approached tribal and county leaders and asked those individuals to select a representative to participate in the project. So gave an overview of what we were looking for and asked them to select who they felt would be the best spokesperson for their jurisdiction. We used an institutional review board approved questionnaire to ask questions to the tribal and county representatives, and that was a tool adapted for the Center for Sharing Public Health Services existing CJS arrangement survey. So on that survey, there were items about jurisdictional information, so, how big is the jurisdiction, for example, in geographic and population size, items about current CJS arrangements, and then some choice options about whether the jurisdiction was working on accreditation for CJS purposes. It's important to note, too, that we, throughout this project, have honored tribal requests for verbal and face-to-face participation to be culturally responsive and to best meet the needs of the different tribal communities we have had as participants. Response and participation rates. So our tribal response rate was 87%. That is formal participation from 83 of 111 tribes. We also have documented responses from another 14 of the 111 tribes about why they might decline from participation. And some of those reasons for declining were, for example, recent shifts in tribal leaders. So elections occurred within the tribe, and maybe it wasn't a good time to give voice to this issue in the tribe itself. And also there were emergencies going on at the prime time of data collection for a few tribes, so wildland fires that had really incapacitated the tribe to provide feedback at that time in their story and journey of the year. We have 100% participation and response rate then from all 29 counties that were associated with the 83 tribes who participated. So some counties might have 5 tribes, and then some counties we would have an exact 1 tribe to 1 county match, but we do have all 29 counties that are matched with the 83 tribes in our project. To give you an idea of the number of participants who have different roles in the community, it's important to give this bar chart to give you the breakdown of participants. So for tribes, about 36 of 83 participants, about 44% there, were selected to be elected leaders or tribal staff. We also know that then 31 of 83 participants were emergency managers or staff within the tribe, and 14 of 83 were tribal environmental staff. 2 people were from the tribal health clinic. That was a little surprising to us, as we thought maybe that would be a group that tribal leaders selected to respond more frequently. On the county side, it looks like one of my legends there is off the graph. Sorry about that, but the majority of responses came from the Office of Emergency Services. That's who county leaders requested complete our questionnaire. Then health department staff were the next frequent participants. That 1 out of 29 is county administrator. A county administrator participated in the project. Some jurisdictional information for you to give you a sense of an overview of what tribes and counties reported for their population and geographic size. So tribes reported serving between 0 to 84,000 people, counties between 9,500 and 3.2 million people. Geographic size for tribes was reported to be between 0 square miles and 547 square miles. For counties, between 612 and 22,000 square miles. When you see the 0 for the tribal jurisdictions, it's really important to note that for tribes, for example, you might have tribal land which you develop an arrangement to protect, but you don't have tribal residents living on the land, so that would be why your population size of the jurisdiction might be 0. Another historical factor that comes into play with geographic size is that there may be tribes who do work to protect their tribal members, but who are currently landless, meaning they might be trying to reacquire land from the government. That's when 0 might be reported for geographic size. At the advice of one of our advisory group members, some great emergency managers and tribal leaders and county leaders around the state, we also computed the total number of tribes per county that participated in this project. So that's the number of tribes, whether they were involved in our research study or not. Our advisory group thought it would be very important to develop some proportional predictor variables that I'll talk about a bit later, using this total number of tribes per county. So across the 29 counties in the study, there was a range between 1 and 18 tribes, and on average, about 7 tribes per county. In order to assess the prevalence and scope of cross-jurisdictional sharing, we coded categories based on the responses from tribes and counties. So 5 different types of CJS arrangements we coded. Whether or not the jurisdiction reported having formal arrangements, that could be memoranda of understanding, formal written mutual aid arrangements. Whether there were informal or customary arrangements, which could include handshake or verbal agreements. Whether there were service-related arrangements, and you might think of those like as-needed contracts or perhaps consultations between jurisdictions before, during, or after emergencies. Shared functions with joint oversight arrangements, and then lastly, regionalization arrangements. So I like to think of regionalization as with the example of, let's say there were 2 fire departments, a tribal fire department and a county fire department. If those 2 jurisdictions merged into one fire department that served both jurisdictions, that would be regionalization for purposes of our coding. Overall, we found that about 37 of the 83 tribes and 5 counties of the 29 reported not having any of those 5 arrangements in place. And it's important to note then that across those 5 categories, you could have up to 5. It could be that a tribe or a county reported having 3 or 4 or 5. Those categories are not then mutually exclusive. So if you look at the bar graph on this slide, you'll see that 46 tribes and 22 counties had some level of CJS between 1 to 5. So most frequently reported were informal arrangements for both tribes and counties at 34 reports of that from tribal jurisdictions and 16 from counties. And then you'll notice the pattern is similar across reports. So next most frequently reported for CJS arrangements were shared functions with joint oversight, and then formal arrangements. If you looked at all the tribe responses and then all the county responses, they ranged between 1 and 3 arrangements for tribes, which means that none of the tribes reported 4 or 5 items out of that 5-part list. And then for counties, the responses ranged between 1 and 4 arrangements, which means that there were counties that did report up to 4 arrangements, but no counties that reported 5 arrangements out of the list. That might make you ask or consider then, well, if it's that those categories aren't mutually exclusive and you could have more than one type of arrangement, how are the 5 types of arrangements intercorrelated or interrelated for the tribal and county jurisdictions? So I have 2 tables here just so you can see those intercorrelations. For tribal arrangements, which is that table at the top there, you'll notice that formal arrangements for tribes, those were significantly positively associated with service-related, shared functions with joint oversight, and regionalization arrangements, meaning that higher numbers of formal arrangements were associated with higher numbers of all 3 of those other types of arrangements. Informal arrangements, perhaps intuitively, were negatively associated with formal arrangements. So the more formal arrangements in place, probably the fewer informal. That was the same pattern then for the counties, that negative correlation between formal and informal arrangements. But for counties, formal arrangements were significantly positively associated with service-related arrangements, and there was also a significant positive association between informal arrangements and shared functions with joint oversight. More complicated, or I guess you could say comprehensive analyses were then undertaken. So what we did next was take a look at associations between jurisdictional measures and CJS measures. So on that table, that would be looking at the association between the items on the left and the items on the right. Jurisdictional measures that were considered were population size, geographic size, total number of tribes per county, and then these 2 proportional scores that our advisory group thought were very important to create as predictors or as independent variables. So a proportion number 1 was the total number of tribes in the county to the county population size, and then that second proportion would be the total number of the tribes in county to the county geographic size. Those measures were examined in association to the measures on the right, CJS measures. So the sum of CJS arrangements, whether tribal or county jurisdictions were reporting anywhere between 0 to 5 arrangements, that sum score. And then also additional analyses were conducted to examine the relation between the jurisdictional measures on the right and each type of the 5 CJS arrangements. So for example, between population size and having formal arrangements. There were 4 statistically significant findings for tribes. The first, there was a negative association between number of CJS arrangements and proportion of total tribes to county population size. So one way to interpret that is that tribes with a higher number of CJS arrangements were in counties with fewer tribes to overall county population size. another way that I think about this is with a very simple example, making up, for example, that there were 5 tribes in a population of 100 people, which would probably not happen, but 5 tribes to 100 people in a county compared to 10 tribes to 100 people in a county. It would be that group of 5 tribes that might have higher sum of CJS arrangements, not the group with 10 tribes, which would be have a bigger concentration of tribes to county population size. The more straightforward positive associations between 3 of the sets of variables. So there was a significant positive association between formal arrangements and population size. Formal arrangements were associated with having a larger population size. Shared functions with joint oversight arrangements were also associated with having a larger population size. And shared functions with joint oversight arrangements were associated with having a larger geographic size in square miles. The first part of this slide is exactly the same as on the slide previous to this one. However, there is one significant finding for counties to point out. So for county jurisdictions, there was a positive association between informal or customary CJS arrangements and total number of tribes in county. So that would be that third bullet point on the left under jurisdictional measures. That was significantly positively associated with having informal arrangements on the right-hand side of CJS measures. To take this one step farther, we were also curious about whether tribes and counties agreed that they had no CJS arrangement or any CJS arrangements in place. So making a dichotomous coded variable out of the responses we received. So interestingly, about 46 of 83 of tribe-county pairs or dyads agreed that they had no arrangements or some arrangements in place. 11 of the 83 pairs said, you're right, both of us don't have, when we matched the responses, both were saying, nope, we don't have anything in place with each other for CJS. 35 of the 83 pairs agreed that they did have something in place. And we left this a little more conservative here by letting it wasn't that we exactly matched the type of arrangement that both jurisdictions said to calculate this, but just that both jurisdictions said something was going on that signaled agreement between the two. Then on the other hand, 37 of 83 tribe-county pairs, about 45% disagreed about having no or any CJS arrangements. In 26 of the 83 pairs, the county reported having CJS, but the tribe did not report any level of CJS. In the remaining 11 of 83 pairs, the tribe reported CJS, but the county did not. To further test it with inferential statistical analyses and to think about association between measures, then we examined that agreement, that dichotomous agreement where one equals yes or agree, tested that against each type of arrangement to see if there was an association between tribe-county agreement and specific CJS arrangements. So I can say for counties, there were no significant relations between the variables on the left and the variables on the right. For tribes, there were 3 statistically significant findings, which were post hoc correlations revealed to be positive. So that is if tribes reported formal arrangements, informal arrangements, or shared functions with joint oversight arrangements, all 3 of those were positively associated with the agreement of the tribe-county together. So for example, if a tribe was reporting a formal arrangement, that was associated with the pair agreeing that they had some level of CJS in place. It's also important to point out that for reasons that escape me, maybe just my memory, that could be it, I did compute the tribe-county dyad agreement in relation to that sum score of CJS agreement that was on the previous association testing slide a few slides back. And that was significant also for tribes. So there was a positive association between tribe-reported sum score and the agreement of the dyad. For counties, those relations were not significant. As a last step in analyses, we did examine then how many tribal and county jurisdictions mentioned accreditation as a reason or one of the reasons for current tribe-county CJS efforts. Only 3 of 83 and 2 of 29 counties did indicate that they were engaged in accreditation, either to working on CJS to meet, to achieve, to maintain accreditation benchmarks. And there were 2 accrediting bodies that were mentioned then across those 5 jurisdictions that reported working on that. To summarize briefly some findings for you before I talk about our next steps for dissemination and research, I think one of the largest takeaways from addressing this first research question of our project is that contrary to what we believed when we started this work, it was often that tribal and county leaders did not designate health clinic or department staff to participate in the project. And I think that the takeaway from that might be that if as health officials or health departments or health clinics begin to think about emergency management and cross-jurisdictional sharing between the two, there is a great importance in involving tribal leaders or designated emergency, environmental, or county staff in the development and sustaining of those CJS arrangements. We kept thinking that maybe things would circle back to the health staff, but tribal leaders especially often wanted to take an active role in emergency management themselves. And it could be that that's very useful to consider when trying to develop arrangements with the health sector, would be involving these government leaders and elected leaders in that process. Also found by this study, CJS arrangements, including formal arrangements, were associated with tribe-specific population sizes and how many total tribes there were in the county jurisdiction. It will be important for counties to consider informal arrangements, especially with smaller tribes, as a first step to maybe developing a relationship or developing formal arrangements for public and community health, but also important to remember as counties to reach out and do outreach to the tribes that were in counties with a greater number of tribal jurisdictions, greater concentration of tribes, because of that one finding that suggests that maybe it's not a power in numbers thing that leads to a greater number of CJS arrangements. The more tribes, the higher level of arrangements they have in place. It could be that what our study has shown that right now, when there's less density of tribes to total overall county population size, that's who's got the arrangements in place, that relationship built, and things are moving forward. So outreach should be tailored to the counties with a greater number of tribal jurisdictions. Finally, tribe-county agreement was associated with tribal report of CJS arrangements, highlighting the very important step of engaging in cross-jurisdictional communication to verify, for counties and tribes to verify with each other that both are on the same page about what's going on. In this project, accreditation-related CJS arrangements were limited. This could signal an opportunity, an avenue for improving population and community health through accreditation, but also might suggest that there are other key reasons that jurisdictions might consider developing CJS arrangements, at least for the case in California, where there seemed to be work going on, but it didn't seem to be closely linked or accreditation did not seem to be undertaken by as many of the jurisdictions as maybe we thought. Next steps for dissemination, we plan to share these findings with our project advisory groups, tribal leaders, at some national conferences, regional roundtable meetings that we'll host between tribes and counties in California later this year, and in reports and manuscripts. And in terms of next steps for research, we will begin to work and address those 2nd through 4th research questions that I outlined previously in this webinar, and looking at the tribe-county agreement variable and those different levels of agreement, layers of agreement, and selecting our smaller subset of tribe-county pairs to examine the values that those types of agreeing tribe-county pairs, what is the value placed on CJS arrangements for all of those 4 groups. So I will click here and then turn back over to Rick to moderate. This is our project page that you can access with the web link at the top. And before I shift back to him, I do want to say thank you to the group for being here today, to my project advisory group who, as I mentioned, are great leaders around the state of California, and without whom I would know far less than I do. And also to my wonderful staff here at CTEC who worked very tirelessly to make these findings possible to present to you. Thank you.
Maureen, thanks so much. We have 2 folks who graciously agreed to provide commentary in today's presentation. The first is Michael Mudgett. Michael is an enrolled member of the Spirit Lake Nation in North Dakota and an epidemiologist for the California Tribal Epidemiology Center housed within the California Rural Indian Health Board. He obtained a Master of Public Health from the University of North Dakota, and previously he's worked with the National Resource Center on Native American Aging and the Urban Indian Health Institute. Michael, would you have some commentary for us?
Yes, I would. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Maureen, for that overview of the project. And thank you for everyone for listening in. I'll speak a little louder because there might be a little disconnect in the volume. So let me start by giving some commentary on where I think there's some value in this project and maybe some implications for future research. So let me start off by talking a bit about the methods that Maureen went over a bit. You heard her talk about tribal interviews and county interviews, and I think about the value in that and how they obtain that information. And from the tribal perspective, it's a verbal and face-to-face. And it's important to understand that, thinking about, past mistrust in research with tribes in American Indian, Alaska Native communities. And so the project really tried to honor that with the tribes, having that verbal phone interview or face-to-face if they so chose, and that worked. And that should be kept in consideration when you're collecting that data and information from tribes. Another point to make is about the tribal differences. The cross-jurisdictional sharing arrangements differ from tribe to tribe, and that's important to consider that tribal uniqueness and what that means. It's valuable to understand how tribes differ, and that they do differ, in fact, with their government-to-government relationships. This is an important concept just to overall understand, especially if you're undertaking a project like this. There's no one-size-fits-all for tribes, and when you approach it from that perspective, I think tribes will value that much more. Another point to shed light on from this is about tribal leaders. Maureen had talked about it and made some very good points in talking about how tribal leaders in this project with cross-jurisdictional sharing, they are really the key decision makers. When it comes down to it, they should be included in the process, whether that process is research or whatever collaborative effort. Tribal leaders inform public health decisions, and they may be involved in developing and even sustaining cross-jurisdictional sharing functions. So future research in this area and research in general actually should keep this in mind. That's a very important concept to understand and important to consider when you think about the tribe-county cross-jurisdictional collaboration. This research, in conclusion, actually, this project describes the current state of cross-jurisdictional sharing for emergency management between tribes and the counties in California, for which there's little, if any, information prior to the study in California. I'd like to note that there had been plenty of research studies that had focused on this area in other regions and parts of the country in those states. But one thing very valuable about this project, as some of you may know, the vastness of California and the tribes that are within it. You heard Maureen talk about the 111 tribes and how this project has a huge response rate from the vast majority of those tribes. So we have a much larger response pool than most other projects. So the scale of this project is much larger. So I wanted to give my 2 cents on where I think it would be most valuable, and this is where I think the implications for future research will lie. And I want to end with that and say thank you for everyone and allowing me to come in and provide my perspective.
Michael, thanks so much. Our next person providing commentary is Charles Magruder. Charles is the Chief Medical Officer for the Indian Health Service California Area Office. He is a graduate of the University of Kansas School of Medicine. He completed residencies in preventive medicine and psychiatry from Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and also holds a master's in public health from the Harvard University School of Public Health. He has extensive experience in public health, medical epidemiology, primary care, and medical administration. Charles, do you have some commentary for us? Charles?
Oh, hello. I'm sorry. Had to
no worries.
My phone connected there. Hey,
Oh,
first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate the time and energy that has gone into doing this research and this presentation, and I genuinely feel that a lot of important information has been gleaned that's going to be very beneficial for our communities. One of the reasons that I say this is based upon some experiences that I've had over the past few years, two in particular where we had some events where prominent fires occurred. In one of those scenarios, the tribe and the county had a very good relationship, had a lot of agreements in place, and immediately, when the event was discovered, the county resources were on the scene immediately. This, by most estimates, most perspectives, had a great deal to do with ensuring that that particular event was not more harmful than it was. In another scenario I noted, and I should point out perhaps that in both of these situations I was called to be on site, so I was seeing things firsthand. But in the other situation, there were no relationships established. The county did not respond immediately. There were not communications then that were easily in place to garner state and federal resources as well. And the ultimate outcome was not as good. Now, of course, those are just two case studies, but that had a major impact on me in terms of how I saw these things. And that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate that CRIB is taking the time and putting a lot of energy and effort into what I see as a very important work. So one of the things that I do routinely when I go out and visit our various clinics is I also look at this not only as a tribal to county interaction, but I think it's also important, and perhaps that's my best perspective, in looking at our clinics that are serving the American Indian population in these tribal areas and ensuring that they also take a look in conjunction with their tribal officials on how they establish these relationships. And one of the things that I always do when I speak with the medical directors at our clinics is encourage them to make a phone call to the local county health officer in the county where they reside, begin a conversation, begin to examine and understand what all is going on in that county with resources that are coming from the state. How can the tribal clinic begin to benefit from that in developing these collaborative relationships? And I've seen it firsthand work extremely well in one location, and I think it can work in a lot of other places as well. And I also want to say that I concur with the idea that if we look at accreditation and the requirements associated with that, I think that could serve as a really great vehicle to enhance our development of these CJS agreements. So bottom line, I think this is a fantastic study. I think we should pay very close attention to it, and I look forward to further work with CRIB in this area and getting these agreements more enhanced and in greater number. Thank you very much.
Charles, thanks so much. We've got time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you type it into the question or the chat box in the bottom left part of your screen. So we have a question from Patrick Libby. Patrick Libby has asked, do you think the level of elected tribal leader involvement described would hold for health service areas other than emergency preparedness? So, Maureen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It's good to see your name up on the chat box there. I do think that is true, but much like the uniqueness of tribes, that can vary from tribe to tribe, also from area to area in this country that may differ. So in California, there is a little bit of a unique relationship between tribal leaders and health programs, tribal health programs or urban Indian health programs. A lot of times the tribes have, in some cases, dedicated all health efforts to that health program through representation where the tribe nominates a board member to serve on the health program board, and then that board member is responsible for different decisions that are made. In other areas of the country, sometimes that's not the process. Sometimes it's that the tribe is actually running the health program or clinic or any other variety or combination that you can think of. That happens in parts of the country. So it could be that there are areas of the nation where CJS between an actual clinic or health program, that it would be just that health program or just that clinic that might facilitate that process with tribal leadership oversight, but perhaps not as heavy of as an involvement. And that could go all the way on the spectrum to what we see in California, though, with some of these smaller lands with rancherias where tribal leaders may have a more integrated role in emergency management and the programming at the health programs, just because those health programs are representing a small population size of tribal members. I think, though, that it's important to remember that in all areas of health, tribal leaders, much like Michael shared during his commentary, thank you, Michael, tribal leaders are the key to decision making, and any efforts to develop CJS arrangements outside of consultation with tribal leaders may not make it very far within the community. I think tribal leadership support is crucial for developing arrangements, or at least in getting somewhere and learning about whether a CJS arrangement is a best fit for that tribe. It's the conversation with the leadership, the health entities, the health programs or clinics, and then county jurisdictions. As best as that can happen, I think that that's where more successful arrangements will fall into place.
Great, thanks. I have a question. So, you looked at 83. Basically, you had responses from 83 out of 111 possible tribes, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So, do you have any sort of idea about how those tribes, for lack of a better word, how do they compare to the ones who did not respond? How do your responders compare to your non-responders, the ones who elected to not be involved in the project? Did you notice any significant differences between the two in terms of what their administrative structure was like or anything like that?
So to clarify, response we had from, I think, 97. Formal participation we had, from the 83.
Okay.
So we end up not being able to really see too much difference between those last few the last number count between 97 and 111 in that larger group. It could just because now we don't have this is a great problem to have, is now we don't have too many people to collect information from, so we can't see differences between the two groups. But I think anecdotally speaking, we know that there were differences, for example, in the people who participated who found this topic very relevant to them, formal participation, and the group that responded but did not participate, they were very interested in this as a topic. They said that's probably why we got a response rate from that group of 14 of 111 tribes. The difference, though, was that something had happened in the tribe to maybe sway them from participating versus responding, and that might be where there's the difference that I can see noticeably. And it was often that it was elections. That's something that really research in Indian country across this nation. You have to understand that elections might occur right in the middle of a great project, and when you had a person who was going to be the representative, they might not be there anymore or able to give voice. And that's okay, but it might just be then a bad fit for that project at that time for the community. And then also the presence of actual emergencies. That was something that I mentioned briefly in the webinar, but gosh, we had one or two tribes that we tried very much for months and months and months to get them involved, and it was just that they were smaller tribes. A lot of the California tribes are a bit smaller, and there was no capacity to provide or spare an extra person to give voice to an important topic because they had just been wiped out basically by a fire, and all of their buildings were burned or things of that nature. So perhaps that's more where I see the difference between the participating and versus just response and declination group, the group that declined. Anecdotally, those were the differences we saw. I think our data would back that up. But it's a great question and something that we'll look at a little further in what about those 14 other, if I'm doing my math right, 14 other tribes, can we find something that differentiates them or not? That's something we can definitely look at.
We've got another question. This question is, has there been any examination of cross-jurisdictional arrangements on a tribe-to-tribe basis?
Yes, that is a great question. And to my knowledge, nationally, I don't think that has happened, at least for this topic. I don't know if it's happened for other topics. I will say that some of the tribes in California were very excited to have arrangements with each other, tribe to tribe. That's where they felt change would occur if they were engaged in relationships with the county. So I can think of one example in Southern California where there are no formal arrangements with the county, none. That's not an interest, that's not a priority, but you know what? All of the tribes in the county would actually say we work well informally with the county. They have a handshake agreement, that's working for them. So it is informal and works for that group. Also, all of those tribes in that county have worked together to form groups, meetings, regular check-ins with each other to protect each other's people, as well as those informal arrangements with the counties. So I think that's an avenue for future research that is a little beyond the scope of our project, but definitely warrants attention. I think in other areas of the country, that would be something that occurs as well. The tribes are working with each other to develop memoranda of understanding or other arrangements or informal agreements to help each other out.
Great. We've got another question. This question is, will your project develop kind of model cross-jurisdictional sharing arrangements?
Thanks for that question. So this is an interesting learning experience for us here because our plan when we first started out and when this grant was written was that we would find out along the way exactly how to do a model arrangement, and then we could give presentations and suggest that approach. But researchers in American Indian and Alaska Native communities might know that sometimes that approach is not going to work, especially given the great variation between tribes in a particular area. So the thing we found in California through our questionnaire addressing this research question was especially related to tribes being at the place of just considering arrangements with the county, that they needed to build relationship first, to build trust first, or that there were informal arrangements in place that worked for them. So our approach changed a little bit, and some meetings that we'll have later in the year in Northern, Central, and Southern California will not focus on training individuals in like this is a model arrangement that will fit between your tribe and your county, but instead begin to deepen relationships, have networking, share work products that are going on, and discuss informal arrangements as an avenue for promoting perhaps a formal arrangement later on. So I think the short answer to the question is I would love to have a model arrangement, but one thing I have really learned from this project, from the tribes and the counties, is that first step is to start somewhere before that and then work toward developing arrangements that are models for those regions of the state, which is something that we hope that tribes and counties would be able to do after we present all of our findings with this work.
Great. So we have time for a few more questions. I've got another question. So, as Michael kind of rightly pointed out, there's a lot of these tribes are unique entities, right? They have a lot of. I guess there's a lot of heterogeneity between tribal entities. So, we've got 35 states with 556 federally recognized tribes. So, if, let's say other individuals were kind of interested in conducting this kind of research in other areas, what would you say your keys to success were? I mean, I know you spoke to it a little bit, but what do you think really, if you were your top 3 things to remember, what would they be?
Yes, so I think lessons learned, let's see. So the first is to be responsive to whatever it is, if you're talking about the tribal jurisdiction, whatever it is that works for that tribal leader and who they might select to be involved. And how that person might select to participate in a research project, that's very important advice to listen to and to honor. So in the case of verbal or face-to-face meetings, that was the success. That was the only way oftentimes we were able to gather stories, great stories, from tribes who maybe don't know us or, and rightfully so, are kind of skeptical about why we're approaching them about their story and what works and doesn't work for them. I think that was how we got the numbers that we had in this study. Is plain and simple, is a lot of legwork. We did a lot of tours of tribal areas in the state. Michael, and who is on my project team and is newer to our organization here than myself, but I think gives a great perspective on the project, which is why I asked him to be the commentator. Michael and I did tours of Northern California for an entire week, and we'd visit 4 or 5 tribes in a day, some really long days, but that is what worked. And so I think that that's one of the greatest takeaways, to be persistent, but also to be respectful for those tribes who really do, rightfully so, have some historical mistrust of the research process, where maybe they've shared things in the past and the findings have not gone anywhere or have been misused, to say that's okay. You do not have to participate in this project if it's not a good fit for you for those reasons. Sometimes by allowing for that choice, just like with all of the rest of us, to be able to determine where your information is going, sometimes that got a response out of a tribe that we really thought was not going to be interested in participating, was just saying that's okay if it's not a good fit for you. We totally understand. So I think that those are great lessons learned, but we had a lot of staff working on recruiting people for months and months of our time here, so we delayed a little bit on that, and it was just from the researcher perspective, a risk we were willing to take was to be behind in the project at the sake of having more responses and more stories that would give us a better picture of what was going on.
Great, thanks. We just have time for maybe one more question. So I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, but so you looked at a very specific area, emergency preparedness essentially. Do you think there are other areas that might be kind of natural fits for collaboration between tribal and county entities?
Yes, I definitely think if we're talking about health, probably all areas of community health right now, for example, Zika virus and infectious disease, that's something that people are talking about. And we found in some of the emergencies that tribes and counties reported to be relevant to them, that infectious disease was one of the types of emergencies they consider. So in the health realm, I think that could be a potential area for collaboration, is being sure there's a plan in place for outbreak and who will do what. Also to understand what tribal health programs, if they're choosing to report to county health departments in California, that pretty much always occurs at this stage. But tribes as sovereign nations could opt to not always inform county officials of specific types of health situations they have going on their lands or reservations. So the importance of cross-jurisdictional communication to understand that process with disease and health and communicable topics would be vital. And then probably there are other areas of community wellness. Just think about basic wellness and health and physical activities and access to things that would benefit both jurisdictions, people from a health perspective. I certainly think that those are areas where people could benefit from having outdoor areas to walk in space, and maybe there's collaboration between building walking paths and down to that grassroots level of community health too.
Great, thanks. Looks like we have reached the end of our session. So once again, Maureen, Michael, and Charles, thanks so much for participating today. This is fascinating stuff. We've got upcoming webinars you can see on the screen right now. We also have an archive of our webinars at the web address at the top of your screen. If you have any questions or would like to talk more about the project or any projects, please feel free to contact Ann Kelly at the email address on your screen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.